Thank you for downloading this presentation. My name is Chris Merchant. I'm a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. This lecture is a critique of the Channel 4 documentary The Great Global Warming Swindle, which was recently aired in the UK. The lecture was intended for meteorology, geography and geophysics students, and they've all studied climate to some degree, but I hope that a more general audience can also appreciate most of it. You shouldn't need to click any buttons to progress. The timings are recorded as well as this narration. So let's make a start. And they were authoritatively expressed. I'm going to analyse those views in this lecture. I think we'll be learning in two ways really, about climate change, but also about healthy scepticism in the face of media documentaries. On this slide I've listed some of the climate skeptic themes in the documentary that I'm going to deal with. I could do many more, but life and this lecture are too short to do everything, although it's all answerable. So without more ado, let's begin on our first. So we're being told that global temperature should have started rising from 1940 when CO2 levels started rising significantly. And the implication is that because this didn't happen, global warming theory is wrong. Now this is false for several reasons. The first thing is it's overly simplistic. The world is a complicated place. At any given time, more than one factor can be at play, and sometimes those factors will compete with each other, and sometimes they'll reinforce each other. Any climate scientist will tell you there are several factors that can affect climate. The brightness of the sun, how many large volcanic eruptions there have recently been, and on the human side, in addition to greenhouse gases, how much atmospheric aerosol is emitted by industry. Atmospheric aerosols include dust and the sulfates that form from the industrial gas sulfur dioxide, and the effect of these aerosols in aggregate is to reflect sunlight back to space, cooling the Earth. Now during the post-war economic boom, industry was relatively dirty, and the aerosols in the atmosphere were high in industrialised areas, and this is at least partly responsible for that period of cooling. The more recent warming trend associated with greenhouse gases emerges as industry cleans up its act in the 70s and 80s. Now, there's another factor, which is that it takes a long time to heat up a planet, especially a planet with oceans, because the oceans can absorb a lot of heat for a little amount of temperature change. And so, for a second reason, we wouldn't expect the temperature signal to respond immediately to changes in carbon dioxide. It takes at least decades. So to emphasise that several factors combined account for 20th century changes, let's look at some slides from the 2001 IPCC report. They show the temperature record in red and several climate model simulations in the grey band. Now in this graph, those climate models are responding only to the natural drivers, solar activity and volcanoes. The models do not capture well what happened, as you can see. This is the same sort of graph again, but this time the models are driven only by the human agents of change, greenhouse gases and industrial aerosols. Again, the models don't capture the record particularly well. Note how the models predict a cooling from aerosols in the post-war period and an increase which is from CO2 in the last few decades. But if we put all those factors together in this final graph, then the model simulation begins to look pretty much like the record. So it's just too simplistic to argue that the temperature record should reflect a single variable. If you include them all, as here, it begins to look like we understand the 20th century temperature changes pretty well. So this apparent convincing correlation, well, has the data been manipulated? I can't really say, but I have my suspicions. I'll leave you to decide for yourself. Certainly the data shown stopped at 1980, and that's when the correlation they were trying to prove breaks down thereafter. So we have a method of persuasion, selective use of data. It's very common, of course, but it's not good practice. So climate scientists are in it for the money. Research funding has increased, so to get their research funded, we perpetuate this myth about global warming. Well, this is a very common type of argument. It's got a name in Latin, ad hominem, which means against the man. So you're arguing against the person and not against their argument. An example would be, he's a liar, therefore what you just said is a lie. which on reflection obviously doesn't follow because liars can tell the truth sometimes. The particular version we have in the documentary is ad hominem circumstantiae. In other words, your circumstances are suspicious, so what you're saying is untrue, and this is a fallacy. We need to take arguments on their merits as arguments, independently of who is doing the argument. If you conclude that someone is not correct, then you can look at their circumstances to see why they might be saying what they're saying. But we should never argue from the circumstances to the truth or otherwise of a proposition. But sadly, of course, we see this all the time, and not just in politics. A related tactic used the other way is called the appeal to authority. Did you notice that the interviewees were always Professor this or medal winner at that? This tells you nothing, in fact, about their views, about the truth of their views. And plenty of people who disagree with these guys have medals too. I don't have any medals, and I'm not a professor. And it doesn't mean that you should trust me, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't trust me. So, to summarise, here are the techniques that are used in the Great Global Warming Swindle to try to persuade us of their case. It's a very powerful, professional, polemical film, very entertaining, that presses all the right buttons for making us angry at these obnoxious climate scientists who are hoodwinking us. And of course, once angered, most people stop thinking clearly. And in the documentary we've seen half-truths, the use of false dichotomy, selective presentation of data, at least, and also ad hominem attack and appeals to authority. There's one other thing that it seems that has been used in the making of this documentary. And it's a technique that's, again, very common and very easy to exploit. It's quoting people out of context. One of the interviewees is complaining about the context in which his interview has been presented, since the overall effect is to completely misrepresent his views on climate change, which is something he is personally concerned about. So, just to show you how easy it is to do this, I thought I'd deliver my final verdict on this documentary, The Great Global Warming Swindle, through the very lucid words of Nigel Calder, former editor of New Scientist. Well, Nigel, you said it. Thank you for listening.